Well, it's a great pleasure, John, to see you here, although not really here, and a great pleasure to be asked by ADRA, of which I'm these days the patron, to introduce you. I feel a bit ordinary. We spent a few years bucketing each other in the Parliament here, but that's all a long time ago. John and I first met when he came into the Parliament in 1975. I got here in 1973. And then I was attorney in the 80s and he was attorney in the latter part of the 80s. So we have had a long association, and it is an honour to introduce him on this topic. As a former attorney, John probably shares my view that too many people are now adopting expressions like rule of law or procedural fairness and using it as a shibboleth to beat somebody over the head rather than understanding exactly what it actually means. So, you all right, John? You seem...
Yeah.
All good. But anyway, suffice to say that you're going to give us a presentation now, which I think is very topical. Will be much appreciated by those who are online and the gallant few who are here in the Jubilee Room at Parliament House. You were an honourable opponent and you've become a very good friend. So please give us the benefit of your wisdom. John Dowd, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, mate. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, and for that kind introduction. Although we were political opponents, we were never personal opponents, and it's very good to count you now as one of my friends. And I'm sorry that I can't be in the room there with you, but I'm almost over COVID, and so I won't do a test until after the meeting to say whether I am or whether I'm not. What you've got in this subject matter is a series of very interesting questions, and it's therefore necessary to do a background on where the law is and what changes have occurred, and it will be necessary to go over matters that for some of you are fairly obvious, but for others of you, they won't be all that clear. And unfortunately, Australia is a complicated country, and it's therefore necessary to perhaps for some of you over-explain the problems, and for others it will be fairly trite. Australia is known correctly as a common law country. Common law countries are like the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, which divides powers between the central government and the state governments, and to some extent the territory governments, although they are less in status and can be overruled by the Commonwealth. The reason that I bring that issue in is that the common law continues to operate, and the states and the Commonwealth all have either direct or persuasive governments, as indeed the other common law countries do, so that if a decision is made by a court in the United Kingdom or in Canada or the United States, it can have very strong persuasive authority, but not binding authority. So that's the common law contract. when we were given the power to make our own laws under the Colonial Laws Validity Act, each of the states then could, as well as the statute law that we inherited from England, the law of the states became law, and there was a development here of the common law by judge-made law. What then happened was that we became a commonwealth and eventually became quite separated from the United Kingdom, although we had the right of appeal to the Privy Council until the 70s or 80s. I had the pleasure of having Trevor Morley, who some of you will have heard of, a great lawyer, lead me in a Privy Council matter the only time I got there. The law, therefore, is complex because it is made up of statute law, common law, customary law, subordinate law, and each of those has an effect. As Terry well knows, when there is a crisis, such as a terrorist issue or a matter such as a pandemic, governments have to be perceived as doing something about it and solving the problem. And ministers of the government, and often the Attorney General, will be advised by officers of their department, as well as by the State Crown Solicitor and the Solicitor General, on what law should be brought about to create a solution to the problem. And but of course, there are other ministers, such as the Health Minister, who will have also powers under his statutes and common law to create laws themselves. Now, normally, new laws of other ministries go past the Attorney General, and the Attorney General will approve those laws. But you must remember that a cabinet is made up of politicians who are wishing to be perceived and wishing to solve problems, and very often are persuaded by civil servants to take a particular course of action. Now, the problem with that is that ministers are somewhat susceptible to adopt a solution put by the ministerial departments and sometimes by the police as to how a law is to be dealt with and how a problem is to be solved. Sorry, all I can see is a ceiling from the camera that I'm looking at, so you'll forgive me if I find that disconcerting. Whatever the camera is I was looking at now is pointed to the ceiling. The problem, therefore, is that there is a tendency for civil servants or the police or the health department or whatever to bring about solutions which are overstepping the mark of what ought to occur. There is a tendency for civil servants who want to please ministers to come up with solutions which are apparently going to solve the problem, but very often overstep the mark. Therefore, usually under a lot of political pressure, ministers will take to cabinet and cabinet to the party room and then introduce to the parliament powers to deal with problems that are perceived to be there. Now, I want to remind you that the common law countries like ours have civil laws governed by the courts, but also have criminal laws. Civil laws are on the balance of probabilities. Criminal laws are beyond a reasonable doubt. So a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. So that there is a serious problem that solutions tend to have common law, tend to have criminal offences as against civil offences, and that means that any offence has to be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt, and that is subject to appeal and so on. Most people don't appeal convictions, but have to live with that conviction, even though there's a lot of relativity between, a lack of reciprocity and relativity between particular offences, so that someone asked to pay $1,000 fine for breaching a COVID rule may, in fact, commit a much more serious offence, which under another statute or under the common law doesn't carry that penalty. So that the first problem we have is a tendency for ministers to do something, civil servants to give extensive powers, and the public is told that the powers have been brought about to solve the problem. And very often there is a disconnect between the solution and the problem itself. Now, the difficulty that all of that brings about is that the common law continues to operate. And as you've seen in the recent problems concerning Djokovic, there are problems between states and the Commonwealth. Now, the Commonwealth cannot override some state powers, but in some areas where there is joint power of a state and the Commonwealth can prevail. There are also other provisions in the Constitution, which, as you know, is not a protective constitution, but is rather a demarcation dispute between the states and the Commonwealth. That Section 92 prevails to make trade between the states free of restraint. Now, one of the problems that has been brought about by this is the obvious conflict between the carrying about of interstate trade and protecting the states under their health laws. Health laws are state laws, they are not Commonwealth laws, and the police powers used to enforce entry to a state may or may not be in conflict with the Commonwealth government law and under the Commonwealth Constitution. There has been an obvious reluctance on the part of the Commonwealth, not only for political reasons, but for legal reasons, not to want to take the matter to the High Court. Those, the Clive Palmer types that have talked about taking it there, cannot predict how the High Court will go, because clearly if the state restrictions interfere with trade, such as transport, carrying on a business across states, and other problems, and better lawyers than me may in fact clearly want to do something about interstate trade, but have been reluctant to do so. So that at the same time as statutes are brought in creating health offences and criminal sanctions, at the same time the common law still applies. For instance, an employer has a common law duty that is determined on the balance of probabilities to exercise a duty of care to the people that he deals with and to his other employees. So that if, for instance, the Commonwealth prohibited someone from refusing to employ someone that's not vaccinated, then the employer still has a duty of care to the employer, the other employees, to only employ double vaccinated people, irrespective of their right not to be vaccinated. Now that is going to become much more complicated with the COVID Omicron variation, where getting it, as I just have, I assume it's Omicron, doesn't protect you against getting it again. So that the common law duty to prevent people infecting other members of staff is going to be very much more difficult to determine. To give you an example, which Terry's heard me say before, what is the situation about influenza? Now, influenza kills more people every year than COVID ever will. And most of us get injections, vaccination against flu, each variant that comes out each year. Now, there's a real issue as to whether an employer has an obligation to employ rules that every employee shall be vaccinated against the flu to protect other employees, because several thousand people every year get infected at work or in the community by flu and die from it. So it underlines the fact that although the common law imposes a duty of care, the solution which was available under the Delta variant, where giving double vaccination was a general protection, the Omicron variant will make it very difficult because we may find ourselves unable to protect ourselves by a series of vaccinations, boosters, and whatever. If we all can get it again, and we may find that variations in vaccines and new vaccines may not work. So that's one area of the common law, which is part of the rule of law, that will take a lot of resolution, particularly as the coronavirus grows and varies, because it will tend to reduce after a time, but we can't predict what will happen, as happened initially when it was released from Wuhan in China. Now, the big problem about the laws that ministers bring in is that there is a tendency for civil servants, having been given power, to not to advise ministers to keep those powers going. Very few laws get repealed, and civil servants can normally work up very good laws as to why, very good reasons as to why the law should remain in place. For instance, a civil servant will come to a minister and say, Minister, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, and either variants of the coronavirus will occur and or new viruses may occur in the future, and we may want those powers. So that there is a tendency for criminal statutes to get onto the statute books and remain on, giving much more power to the government than it often needs. I'm not saying that some laws are not necessary and some criminal statutes have to be there to protect the community, but the extent of them is very difficult to determine, very easy to bring about, and very hard to remove. Now, I want to just mention to you a new issue, which is subordinate legislation. Subordinate legislation is ministerial regulations that become law under powers given by an act. The powers given by the act allow regulations to be made, and in some cases permit offences, create offences. In most cases, those can be disallowed by a parliament or a House of Parliament, and because upper houses tend not to be controlled by the government, can be disallowed and cease to be law. There has been a tendency, however, for all governments to bring in laws which are not subject to disallowance. That is, we need to watch that there are laws coming in all the time that by the civil servants through the minister by proclamation that cannot be removed except by act of parliament. And that's, in a sense, partly relevant to our discussion this afternoon, but are a big problem that we need to deal with, and we need to educate the public on. So the rule of law, therefore, leaves us with a common law, mainly a duty of care, as well as the other obligations that you have to employees. Secondly, criminal statutes, which may or may not be more than are appropriate in terms of powers and in terms of fines, which may be way beyond a common law or other statutory fines. And the subordinate legislation, which will be used to control people, but may not be easily removed. The rule of law, therefore, in Australia, because we're a federation and have a mixture of laws, are very much better than centralised governments, because states are more likely to introduce new laws and more likely to vary the laws and to teach each other what laws they should be, not just politically, but in terms of statute law. The Commonwealth is much slower to remove powers and much slower to bring in powers, but nevertheless, federations like ours are better lawmakers than centralised governments. That general discussion is dealing with the rule of law as we have it here in Australia, and I thank you for being patient enough to listen to my explanation, and I hope that I will generate some questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that, John. Do we have any questions from the people on the Zoom? If I can just unmute everybody. I think you can just unmute yourselves if you've got a question. Any questions from in here?
I have a question. It's Tanya here. I'm just a little confused about a bill that I saw in New South Wales state being put forward, and I think it's being looked at January, February, about the health and safety requirements, workplace health and safety requirements, becoming businesses' responsibility for vaccine injury. I'm not sure if you've seen that, but I'm very interested in you discussing a bit more of what you just spoke about. It was very, very good information, actually. But yeah, as well as the topic that I've just raised. Yeah, I'd like to know about that, as well as more of what you just discussed about the difference, between what's happening at the moment.
Yes, there is a tendency for governments, when facing the problem, to bring in state laws which cover the common law. And the difficulty we're going to have to face as it becomes more obvious that vaccines don't necessarily work and necessarily give protection is that they may bring in a law which is a very blunt instrument, which casts a duty on employers to protect their employees by criminal sanctions, whilst at the same time the law about the duty of care, which I opened with, is yet to be resolved and changes as the common law duty of care, the employer, the obligation to its staff, which an employer has, are still matters of changing under circumstances such as the coronavirus.
That's really concerning if that's Yeah, I mean, what you're saying, I've never heard of this before, and I'm sort of fairly closely linked to a lot of these discussions, particularly around workplace and things like that. And it's very alarming, and I'm concerned that a lot of people don't realise this.
True.
Hmm.
Thank you.
There's a question by Victor. Victor, do you want to read out your question, please?
Oh, would you mind? Because I'm on the telephone, and it's hard to do it both on the telephone. Would you mind reading it out?
I'm sorry, what do you want me to do?
Would you mind
I'll
reading
read
it
it
out?
out.
Because I'm on.
Yes.
I'm
No,
mobile.
that's fine. Okay.
Okay.
The question says, please excuse my question if it is premature. It appears to me that you have not noted the character of influenza when no coercive laws or regulations exist, whereas for COVID there are laws and regulations. My anti-vaxxer friends, among whom I wish to circulate this lecture, will no doubt direct their attention to this.
The reason I mention influenza is to underline the common law duty of care. Influenza is different to COVID, but absent the criminal statutes that have been brought in, the protection against influenza may be greater than COVID. And I wanted to underline the fact that states and Commonwealth have brought into statute powers, enforceable powers by criminal sanctions on something which is less of a concern than something such as influenza. Influenza kills more people than COVID. We don't do anything about it. And we need there to be very careful about what laws we bring in to enforce aspects of the COVID culture that we have here now in Australia.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions from those on Zoom? Any questions from in here? Muriel? Muriel, maybe you can come over here, it might be easier. If you can come over here.
Catherine, may I ask one question? And forgive me, this one may be a little too lateral, and please say so if so. I'm currently working with two large corporate organisations, and their senior executive groups are looking at all sorts of the issues you're talking about. But the one they're making a big shift to and investing a large amount of money in change management programs is in the mental health area, and it's being driven directly by the impact. Do you have any comments on that in relation to the things you've been saying?
The mental health aspect of the coronavirus, be the lockdowns and see the obligations on employers, are developing and being exposed. There are many children who are suffering from mental health. There are many employees suffering from mental health problems, and there will be a growth in the need for treatment. And it is a factor which must be taken into account when we do things like lockdown to deal with the growth of mental health illnesses and exacerbation of existing illnesses. I used to sit on the Medical Health Review Tribunal and was very conscious of the effects which mental health variations have. So that employers need to be very careful that they look to the downstream consequences of things such as lockdown. This is particularly a problem in teaching, where not only at school level, but at a high school level, where human animals who get psychological benefits from dealing with other people may suffer from that, and mental health needs to be well up the list of concerns we have about government and employer decisions.
Excellent. In relation to duty of care, John, may I ask, is there any particular cautionary note in relation to them undertaking such a change process and their duty of care to those downstream effects?
Sorry, just repeat that again. You're not entirely clear.
In relation to the duty of care factor and an organisation who's entering into a change management program around mental health and your comments about the downstream impacts,
Yes.
what's your cautionary note about, one, their knowledge of mental health management to handle such matters?
Major employers must get advice from psychiatrists and psychologists about the effect of the various sanctions like criminal laws, lockdowns, workplace changes, to take into account. Employers must not make themselves experts, and they must seek advice. That's very difficult for smaller employers because the cost of doing that is in some cases horrendous, but nevertheless, there is a duty to get expert advice, as I said, not only from psychiatrists, but from psychologists about the effect of the measures you bring in, because your duty of care is a duty to get legal as well as medical advice.
Yeah. Thank you
This
so
is-
much.
This is really, really important information. I'm wondering at the end, with the recording, are we able to get a hold of a recording?
Yes, you will be able to, Tanya. We're recording this session, so we've got the
Thank
permission
you.
for that.
It's incredibly important, and I really appreciate this information. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a very important topic, actually, that really needs to have further discussion, and we haven't had the opportunity to have discussion on this topic, so it's one of the things that ADRA is very keen to promote. Morel, would you like
If I can just remind people that I am now a non-practicing barrister, and as such can't give legal advice. I'm giving you general advice, but not legal advice. And you should obtain expert opinion from a practicing lawyer. All you get here is my experience about a little bit of law, but I'm not giving legal advice as such.
Thank you, John.
John, my name's Morel, and I'm a visitor here today, as we just honoured my late husband. But I'm an employer and an employee of my own business, my naturopathic business. And it was very interesting, and I'd like further comment, if you may, of the fact that as an employer, I need to have that duty of care, but I also need to respect the human rights of the people that work for me, and also the duty of care, as you have rightly said, that vaccines are not the solution and they are appearing, they don't work. And what if we actually insist as an employer that our employees take a vaccine and then they have an injury? So, it appears that the government, as you said, on a state level, are making these laws that are very difficult to remove, and they have dumped them onto the employer. And we're left with this dilemma, and we're told we have to do these things, and they have not the desired outcome.
If someone brings action against you for complying with the state law, you have got a defence to that. So although there is no absolute guarantee, if in fact your employee has a bad reaction to a vaccination, that's a matter that ultimately a court will determine, either a civil court or in some cases a criminal court. If I can just pick up one point that you mentioned, you talk about respecting people's human rights or right to not be vaccinated. I think the community has got itself tied in a knot about respect for human rights. People have human rights, but you don't necessarily have to respect them. You have to accept that they exist. But human rights are not absolute, and human rights that conflict with your obligation as an employer, you got human rights as well as the person who refuses to get vaccinated. We've seen the disaster of Djokovic refusing to get vaccinated, and to say he's got a human right to do that, whoopie-doo. The fact is, he chose not to get to. You don't have to respect it. You should learn to accept that that's the way he is, and anti-vaxxers, and except unless they've got an exemption, can exercise that right, but it doesn't necessarily have to be respected. And your right and obligation and duty as an employer needs to be looked at in relation to that person's so-called right.
Okay, thank you.
Any further discussion?
Yes. I heard it was announced that Boris Johnson is talking about doing away with all restrictions, all everything, just that going open slab, doing away with isolation, which means everybody can just go about their business as normal. That's going to open up another whole can of worms.
But I don't defend anything that Boris Johnson does, but it may ultimately be the way the coronavirus develops that it becomes very difficult to justify a series of criminal laws which cast obligations on employers, on restaurateurs, to teachers, to school children, to everybody, to make them enforceable. And he may be in fact anticipating a possibility of the way the coronavirus may develop, that in fact there's not a lot that you can do to stop it. Having found out that the coronavirus may become possibly non-vaccinatable, may well be that he is in fact correct.
There is talk though at the moment with Pfizer CEO coming out saying they're coming up with some third version, or 1.1, I should say. I'm not sure how that fits in, but you know, obviously it's probably still not completely effective. So I'm really interested in hearing more about that, and also how you were talking about the influenza not being protected. So how does that sit? Is that a state sort of responsibility as well, or a national?
Well, the fact is, no one's going to do anything about influenza because they haven't thus far. It's not in people's consciousness, and people that happily get influenza because they're not vaccinated happily pass it on, happily kill people, as well as infecting people and harming people, but the community doesn't want to know about that. So that, in a sense, I only use it as an example of the minimalist effect of coronavirus that we don't do anything about, and what we do. The drug companies will continue to develop vaccines that they will take a while to protect. They take a while to become effective. They take a while to become approved. And the difficulty that they've got is the virus may well mutate faster than the drug companies can produce drugs.
Yes.
So it's going to be a choice between the whether you take the new vaccinations, and we as a community need to accept that there will be a leapfrogging process for some time to come.
John, if there is such a minimal effect of COVID in relation to the influenza, why has it been declared a pandemic? I mean, I've never understood that.
Because people haven't seen it as a bad thing. Influenza has been around killing people for centuries, millennia indeed. And the COVID type viruses have been around for a long time.
That's right.
But there wasn't enough medical science to find out about them. One of my great grandmothers died in 1919. She was in a Red Cross type society, and at that stage they didn't understand about it. So she caught probably the then Spanish flu and died. Every year we are finding out more and more about the nature of viruses. We are developing more and more measures to protect against them, but we need to accept that knowledge will continue to grow, vaccines will continue to grow, viruses will continue to grow.
There's a little bit on the chat that says from Dan Johnson. Dan, do you want to read that out for yourself?
Yeah, sure. It was just really more informational than anything else. You were asking about why is this now called a pandemic? It's because they changed the definition of what a pandemic actually is. And the earlier definition used to include with enormous numbers of deaths and illness. And by taking that out, anything that's prevalent around the world, even with very, very low fatalities, can be declared a pandemic.
Thank you for that, Dan. We've also got a question there from Mark England. Mark, would you like to read that out?
Yes, hello, Catherine. I just did a quick fact check on whether or not more people have died from flu than COVID. And it appears that there has been information in the Telegraph suggesting that more people have died from flu, but a fact check indicates that in fact twice as many people around the world have died from COVID at least.
Yes, I'm not saying about around the world, because most people around the world probably aren't vaccinated. So I'm only talking about Australia, and I'm satisfied that more people die from the flu. You've got to remember that the flu has now, because of COVID shutdowns is not being transmitted as much. I have a daughter who's a practice nurse, and she is not doing the same number of flu injections now as she did 2 years ago, because people are not getting flu. So because of the lockdowns, now that the lockdowns have ceased and we are back to the community, then flu will grow again.
And I think that's been one of the difficulties, is just that there's been so much information that has been at odds with each other. And the general public is now in a position where they just don't know what to believe. There's been information on government websites that was just clearly incorrect. And if it's on a government website, you would imagine that it would be absolutely accurate. And yet we're getting to a stage where people just don't quite know what to believe anymore.
Well, they've kept fairly good statistics in England and Wales, and from 2019 indicating that over 1,200 people have died there from influenza, whereas 46,700 and more have died from COVID. So where vaccination hasn't been as strong as it has been in Australia, and we know, Boris Johnson and his approach and what subsequently happened, it's been totally disastrous. So there is a lot of misinformation around, and I think we have to be very careful with statistics at the moment, and hindsight's of course a very good thing, and I certainly respect John.
But can I say,
experience.
The use of influenza is only an example. I'm not proposing anything. There is no move, and there, as I thought I explained, there will not be a move to do anything about it. And we should not get sidetracked into whether you should do something about influenza, because you won't. And there's not a comparison. We're dealing with COVID. That's the matter that states and the rule of law needs to deal with. And we must not get sidetracked into what is, yes, a real issue, but whether the comparison's there or not, there are not and will not be laws about influenza, and we should concentrate on COVID.
So, John, could I just ask you, just to clarify a little bit more? So say if you have a business in New South Wales and someone either has an injury from a vaccine, or someone maybe gets a new variant that's not able to be protected against, or whatever. I'm just wondering what advice would you give for a business with employees, that sort of thing, or even Queensland, either or?
If the person gets vaccinated because of a reluctance to go to work without it, or because they're following some sort of government direction, it doesn't affect the employer at all. The vaccination is outside, and as long as employers don't do vaccinations, there's no duty arises to the employee. The fact that your employees may have COVID is not your responsibility, and you should not worry unduly about it.
Okay, so just going back to what you started with, could you expand a little bit on that, just to be clearer on that one?
How do you mean started?
Oh, sorry, just if you could elaborate a little bit more in relation to where you mentioned about, the variants and how we can't really cover for everything, and what the responsibility perhaps of the employer may be down the track.
Well, as I've said, the employer has no enhanced duty other than any employer to comply with rules and regulations about employment and to provide a safe workspace, any more than that occurred before. The employer is not responsible for whoever injects or infects the person outside. He or she is not in any way has an increased liability, and the person has no cause of action against the employer unless it was caused by the employer, and that's rarely going to be the case.
So sorry, unless it is, could you just say that again?
That there is no additional duty on the employer, and the person, if they have any cause of action, will be an unlikely action against a vaccine or against the person who infected them. There is no additional duty of care caused by the virus.
Okay, so you were saying unless something before, it just cut out a little bit.
I'm sorry, I don't remember. Okay.
John, I guess from a very basic layperson's point of view, if we've had influenza and viruses from time immemorial, why have they targeted COVID? I mean, we had SARS before, and we've managed to get through it all. People just get herd immunity. Yes, people die, but we're all going to die. I really don't understand why they've targeted COVID.
Because we have solutions, because we have remedies, because we have development in medical science that enables us to protect. The bubonic plague and all the plagues that have occurred over history, in a sense, are no different to COVID or influenza or whatever. They have always occurred. It's only because there are governments have powers and drug companies have powers to deal with problems that we're actually concerned. There's been, over the centuries, plagues and plagues and plagues and viruses that have occurred, but there's nothing people A, understood about them, and B, knew what to do about them. So it's solutions which create the debate, not the problems.
I see. There is a chat from Maria Mastriani saying you cannot get immunity against COVID. Would you like to say anything more about that, Maria, please?
Well, with the COVID, unfortunately, the antibodies don't stay in your system. They're only in your system for a very short period of time. So with the vaccines that we're receiving, we're never going to have herd immunity because we don't get immunized against the vaccine. The vaccine only assists our bodies in being able to deal with the infection in a more reduced severity so that we can survive the COVID. So the fact that you have been vaccinated 1, 2, 3, or the 4th booster does not immunize you. And people that have received, in Australia even, who have received both their vaccines and their booster, have had COVID 2 and 3 times. So the thing that we're getting vaccinated or there's going to be herd immunity, it's never going to happen. So the issue is trying to convince people to have these vaccines if they're medically able to have them, so that their severity is minimised, and in that respect, we don't have the fatalities that we do. And so it's really, you can't compare it to an influenza or chicken pox or anything like that, because it's a totally different type of infection. Virus.
Well, of course that's right. And as I've seen, all the pandemics and influence and plagues in the past, they eventually stopped. And it is a possibility that COVID will mutate itself out of a killing to an illness and may in fact reduce altogether. That's not against the point that you make. It's just a comment about what may happen.
Could I just clarify? So, Maria, what about with natural immunity? When you contract COVID itself without vaccination at all?
No, you don't. You don't get an immunity because the antibodies don't survive in the human body. The antibodies only. So when you have the chicken pox, you can develop antibodies and they're in your system for always. But COVID does not leave antibodies. That's why the isolation period is 14 days, because if you're exposed, you can still get the virus up until the 14th day. And then after 14 days, the antibodies are gone. So the same with your protection. If you've had the virus, you're probably protected against reinfection for a couple of days, maybe after you're finished having your COVID. Or,
might have to correct that.
Go ahead.
Actually, the exemptions allow for up to 6 months, which is longer than the COVID jabs allow for immunity from there's no immunity, but protection. Natural immunity will actually be given for up to 6 months, not 14 days. You might want to fact check those statements.
There's no immunity. This is where people are misunderstanding. The vaccine does not give you immunity. It reduces your severity of the infection.
You're saying that the human body has no natural immunity, which is also incorrect. 14 days is not immunity. There's actually up to 6 months.
No, there's a difference between immunity and the antibodies. The antibodies don't survive in your system. That's why humans cannot develop immunity, because the COVID doesn't. The COVID antibodies do not remain in the human system.
Anyway, we seem to be drifting from the rule of law into a general discussion about pandemic.
We have a question.
Yeah, and it's probably for everyone, and it's probably a little bit controversial, but in no way is it disrespectful to anyone that's here and part of this conversation. I just finished 33 days in isolation. So I don't know, Maria, why they did that, why I was in isolation for 33 days. I've got proof of that. So maybe the virus stays in the system for 33 days. I don't know. They took more blood out of me until I refused to give them blood, and they couldn't find anything. So I don't know. The health system in the hospitals are in a mess. I could see that. There was about 9 doctors that I seen, and they all had different ways of dealing with things, dealing with me, and plus the nurses and what they would do. But what I wanted to talk about is not so much me, but the old people lived in this country for at least by science, and this is what we're dealing with COVID is science. All the answers seem to be science, okay? But they lived in this country for 60,000 years for what they found out at Mungo, and that was science, anthropology, archaeology. The old people say they've been here since first sunrise. My old teacher said we've been here for 80,000 years and upwards. There's a site on the north coast, and I'll get to my point shortly. There's a site on the north coast that's 16 kilometres long, and it's all shell from the mangroves to the mountain. The anthropologists and archaeologists said it would take 120,000 years for a lot of people to eat that much seafood, oysters and cockles and fish. So how long were the old people here? And why aren't we looking at the old ways? Because all the answers are here. You talk about this country and we're only talking about what we call Australia. I only walked with my old uncle a couple of weeks back, and he started to look at the detail of plants, the in-betweens. I'd walk with this old man many a times, and then he was showing me all this stuff that I should have known about but never knew about, because by his way of teaching, it was the right time to teach us that knowledge then about these medicines in these plants. We have all the answers in this country, but the problem is, and this is not a question, this is a statement. The problem is there's too much money in this country in the ground, in the land. And they're not going to look at the medicines that can fix this problem, that my old people survived 2 ice ages in this country and at least 80,000 years. All the answers are here, but science seems to have the answers. Well, the scientists are out there in the bush. Them old big trees, them animals, all those things that are part of nature. Nature has the answer for this, but we don't look at it. We've got to get something from overseas. You know, the old people never put a needle into their body. And whether this is a rant or not, it's the truth. How do they live here? How did the old people live here when you got funnel web spider, you got tiger snake, you got brown snake, you got great white shark, you got crocodile? They're just some of the things that'll kill you in this country. COVID's nothing to that. Living in this country that way, you know, living with nature. We don't value nature, but we can learn so much from it. So when are they going to, this is my question, I'll put it on the end of it all. When are they going to recognise the natural living law in this country, which the old people lived with, which is law, the true law? It's not a written law, it's something you have to live. The way a bird flies is natural living law. The way a tree grows, that no scientist can change. They can cut a branch off it, but they can't change the way that tree will shape itself, and they're all individual. When is this country going to recognise our law and make it equal to common law? My old uncle said that years ago. He said, when are we going to have bylaws where they recognise our law equal? He wasn't asking for everything one way, but my question to John is, with no criticism, is when are they going to do that in this country? When you've got such an ancient culture, 80,000 years. We have the 7 strands of DNA here in this country. No one else has that. This is where the people originated from. The answer lies in this country, in the ancientness and the knowledge of what the old people live with. So, John, can you answer that? Or you probably can't. But when are they going to recognise my old people's ways and the natural living law? Because the law we're living with now, all these books I see around me, and I'm not criticising you as lawyers, but can be changed overnight with a swipe of a pen. Natural living law, you muck around with that and you become a victim of that. So if you got to answer, John, I would like to hear that, because we're coming up to an important date, which they call Australia Day. We as Aboriginal people call it Survival Day. We've survived. We survived smallpox. We survived all them flus. You're an older man than me. I've noticed in the last 10 years, probably the last 15, the difference in the flus. I've noticed that. And now they call it a man flu, where you're in bed for 2 weeks. You know, I got COVID and it wasn't like a flu or a cold. What was in my body, whatever it was very unnatural. It took over my whole body. It even took over my spirit. And it was very, very unnatural. And I believe that it was created in a lab. That's my belief. Not.
Right, do you want me to answer your question, or do you want to just?
Yep, no, I want you to answer my question about recognising our law equal to the law that is in writing today.
The Aboriginal law around Australia which of course varies from place to place, is in some ways a lot more sophisticated than the common law or the statute law. The first thing we need to do, and it's long been my view, is to record what the law is. And the Aboriginal people need to record what it is. And I think we should be teaching something more of the Aboriginal law that is recorded. I think that's the beginning. Now, we haven't done it thus far, neither the Aboriginal nor the non-Aboriginal people, but there's a lot to learn from Aboriginal law and custom, and I would like to see it taught, but to teach it, we need to record it.
Yeah, and I can tell you in a very basic form really quickly, the blueprint of Aboriginal law is how you live with nature properly.
No, I understand that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Uncle Dan. I'm just mindful of the time, and I want to thank you, John, for your time. Is there anybody else that would like to say anything at this stage? This is a very controversial topic, and we can get into a lot of controversial parts about the vaccines and about just how relevant they are or how man-made they are. But as we said, the topic is what place the rule of law, and thank you, John, for redirecting us back to that. Is there any other questions at this stage? Do you want to say something?
Catherine, as you're aware, I'll always ask a question if I may. John, I have a great interest as a non-lawyer in getting your view on where should I go as a good source of information about the topic.
Sorry, you've cut out.
Let me try again.
Try again.
Let me try again. Where is a good place to go to get further reference and information about the perspectives that you've been providing for a non-lawyer?
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know.
Don't know. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't help you.
That's right. Thank you.
Mayor?
Hi, Mayor speaking. I'm just asking a question in regard to people that are unvaccinated who need operations, serious operations, or even emergency operations. The ruling for on the grounds of compassion, that would come into play, wouldn't it, John?
Sorry, just repeat the question.
Okay, so I'm just asking for people that are unvaccinated who need operations quite serious or even by emergency, then wouldn't it stand that on the grounds of compassion that they would be allowed to have that operation in it, you know, and not
Yes,
to suffer?
but they are, and the hospitals are not refusing to treat people. No one's being excluded, and if they have been, that should be dealt with from any hospital. Unvaccinated people are receiving medical treatment now, and that will continue.
Yeah, I was just concerned when everyone was in lockdown, they were basically saying that everything had to stop. And yet I'm sure there were people that were suffering quite a bit.
No, there may have been delays and stopping for short periods, but eventually the hospital system will deal with people that need treatment.
Okay, thanks, John.
Christine, would you like to come? Another question from the floor.
Good afternoon, John. I'm Christine. My question is in regards to the pharmaceutical companies themselves. is that they bear no financial responsibilities, John, for children or adults who are vaccine damaged. And I'm just wondering how that could possibly have come about legally and morally, that if, for example, someone gets a really bad reaction to the vaccine and is unable to work, for example, then the manufacturers of the vaccine bear no responsibility whatsoever. And I just
why do you say that?
Because they have indemnity, they cannot be sued or whatever.
Who says that?
Well, that was my understanding, that they
No, they ultimately, all matters are determined by the courts.
right.
And if in fact they have failed in their duty in producing, or somebody is harmed that shouldn't be harmed, then the courts will determine that. It's going to be difficult because vaccine companies have deep pockets, but they're not indemnified. And if someone's courageous enough to bring it, the court will determine that.
Yes, but how achievable would that be for the average person to go through that extremely difficult process, or even be able to finance themselves to get someone like yourself
I think the matter will be determined because there are lawyers around who will bring actions pro bono. It's one thing the legal profession does. It looks after people it needs looking after, and I have no doubt that there's some either lawyer who will take the matter on spec or will do it pro bono, because that's the way we've often solved problems in the past, and this one's no different.
Yes, well, thank you for clarifying that. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks for saying. Would you like to come? One more question for you, John. Terry, did you want to say something?
I take it, Catherine, this is the last one.
If you'd so, I'd be very happy to oblige whatever you wish there, Don. If we want it to be the last one, that will be.
Thank you very much, sir. Look, this is not a question. After listening to the uncle's, what he has to say, what I have to say sounds very stupid, so I didn't want to say. But I thought that what happened with the pandemic and the rule of law, as a migrant, I migrated here 15 years ago, 16 years ago. It actually did not surprise me at all, the behavior that happened, because as I see it as a lawyer, as I saw it from the beginning, the pattern the country sometimes works is that crime, punishment, control. I haven't seen it operates in any creative way when a serious problem is challenged by a very serious problem. Actually, for the last 15 years I have been here, the country has not been challenged by a very serious problem.
Sorry, do you have a question?
No, I don't. So I thought the maturity, my only question is that I was surprised that the 75% of the Australian population was happy with the deportation of Novak Djokovic. So I am not talking about the deportation actually. The way arbitrarily the power was used by the minister, I think as a mature democracy, people should be alarmed because they start like that. I know I'm coming from a country called Sri Lanka, which politicians start gathering power to themselves in 1970s and by 2000 end up in a war. So I was alarmed, and I would like to ask your opinion that why is it like that? Because when a politicians use powers, even they should have the power, but in an arbitrary manner like that, a population in a mature democracy, is it a mature democracy when the population behave like that?
The matter is a matter for a ministerial exercise of power. It went before a court. The court determined disposed of the matter, And as I understand it, Djokovic respects the court, the decision of the court, and the matter is closed.
Thank you.
I think he probably wants to come back next year.
Yeah, but my question is not about him, not about actual the deportation, actual power granted to the minister, which actually should be there in my belief, to use in extreme situations against terrorism and other situations, where the power is used against the world's #1 tennis player who has a good track record, just because it's against the anti-vaccine sentiments. The power use, extreme power is used in a very arbitrary manner, and population seems to support that. And that to me is a very big danger in future, because this is how the rule of law decays little by the arbitrary use of power. I just was asking about your comments about that.
Well, the power is there. It's a general power. It's a power that's been there for many years. It will be exercised from time to time. The only issue here is the prominence of the person involved. It doesn't make the power wrong or the exercise of it wrong. It is a power. We have the right to decide who comes to the country, and if a minister exercises a power given him by the Parliament, then that's a democratic process.
Thank you.
Thank you, William. I'm just wanting to let everybody know there's a chat from Tanya Murdoch saying that it, a very good point. Unfortunately, there is a profit to be made. Tanya, do you want to say anything more about that before we leave?
I was just responding to the original, you know, the comments that were made about how we have natural resources at hand that could be beneficial that's not been considered. And I was saying that I thought that was a very good point, although unfortunately there's not so much profit to be made out of that as perhaps other man-made solutions.
Thank you for that, Tanya. Just
Thank
one
you.
last comment as well from Dan Johnson. Speaking of profits, something to think about. Dan, do you want to continue with what you want to say about that, please? Dan, are you there? Dan Johnson? There we go.
Sorry, I went to the other room. Sorry, the comment. Yeah, it was just in reference to, it was a couple of years ago, but the Supreme Court in the US had a ruling that complementary DNA can be patented. And I know you guys keep calling them vaccines, but they're actually experimental gene therapy. They're still only approved under emergency use authorization. They're not actually approved, they're emergency use authorization. So the mRNA that gets injected creates complementary DNA. It creates cDNA. cDNA can be patented. So don't know what they're going to do with that, but just food for thought.
It just opens up another topic for discussion, which I think we'll have to leave for another time. So thank you very much for that, Dan. Thank you for the people that have been making a contribution today. I really do appreciate all of your input, and very, very much thank you to, very many thanks to you, John, for what has turned out to be quite an interesting and a very informative talk, to say the least. I know we've had some comments about a great session, and Victor, you've made a comment about what a great session you think this has been. I think this is the first of many discussions that we hope to have, and I want to thank you very much, John, for being the very first one to start this conversation going.
Thank you.
And I wish you the best as well for your help.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I think that finalises our session for today. I do note that there will be, as I said earlier, We will be having a plaque ceremony for Uncle Max Harrison. That will be on the 23rd of February, and I've had a request from Mark to attend, and I'll get back to you, Mark. Anybody else who would like to attend that ceremony, please feel free to just send me an email like Mark has done, and I'll get back to you with the details. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a very good evening, and have a very good Happy New Year for the rest of the year. So well done. Okay. I'll just stop the Zooming now. Recording stop.
On the right. On the right.
Thank you very much, Terry.
Of your left hand side.